The bridge behind him was a skeleton of twisted steel and roaring orange flame, a literal path to his past being cremated in real time. Han Du-yun, the man they called the scarred ghost of Seoul, climbed into his getaway car with blood still cooling on his knuckles, expecting the silence of a tomb. Instead, the cabin smelled of laundry detergent and cheap candy. There, curled against the cold leather of the passenger seat, was a little girl who shouldn't exist. Sleeping so peacefully, she looked like an angel dropped into the middle of a war zone. His hand, a weapon that had never once trembled in 20 years of underworld executions, began to shake violently as his gaze dropped to her tiny, curled fist. She wasn't holding a weapon, or a ransom note, or a plea for mercy. She was clutching a tarnished, ornate brass key, the exact same key Du-yun had buried in the coffin of the only woman he ever loved. As the sirens wailed closer and the fire cast a hellish glow over her innocent face, the most feared man in the country realized that the child wasn't a mistake, she was a ghost, and the key she held was about to unlock a door to a hell he thought he had escaped. Du-yun's breathing hitched, the sound ragged against the steady, rhythmic puffing of the girl's breath. He should have dragged her out. He should have driven to the nearest precinct and left her on the curb. That was what a man of his standing did. He eliminated variables. But the cross-shaped scar on his cheekbone throbbed with a phantom heat, matching the orange embers dancing against the windshield. The key was unmistakable. It featured the same intricate, vine-like carvings he had traced with his thumb a lifetime ago, back when his hands were clean, and his name meant nothing to the dead. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers hovering inches from the girl's sweatshirt. He wanted to pry the brass from her grip, to prove it was a replica, a cruel trick played by a rival. But as he leaned closer, he saw the floral backpack slumped at her feet. It was a mundane, dusty thing, covered in patches of cartoon sunflowers, yet it sat in the footwell of his armored sedan like a ticking bomb. Outside, the bridge groaned, a massive section of concrete sliding into the dark river below with a sound like a muffled explosion. The car rocked. The girl, Ara, stirred. Her long black bangs shifted as her head tilted further back against the headrest. Du-yun froze, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence no bullet had ever provoked. For a fleeting second, her eyelids fluttered, and the orange glow of the burning world reflected in her dark, glassy pupils. She didn't scream. She didn't shrink away from the blood-splattered man looming over her. Instead, her fingers tightened instinctively around the brass key, and a small, sleepy sigh escaped her lips. In that moment, the scarred ghost wasn't a boss, or a killer, or a legend. He was just a man looking at a miracle he wasn't prepared to handle. He slammed the car into gear, the tires screaming against the asphalt as he tore away from the inferno. He was fleeing the fire, but as he stole a glance at the sleeping child beside him, he knew he was driving straight into a much deeper, more dangerous kind of light. The sedan roared through the rain-slicked streets of the industrial district, the engine a low, predatory growl that masked the chaos unfolding in the rearview mirror. Behind them, the sky was a bruised purple, torn open by the jagged orange teeth of the bridge fire. Han Du-yun gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. His knuckles were bone-white, stained with the drying copper of men who had tried to take his life less than 20 minutes ago. Every instinct honed over 2 decades of underworld warfare told him to stop, to interrogate the intruder, to find out who had breached his most private sanctuary. But he couldn't stop, not with the sirens multiplying behind him, and certainly not with the girl's head lolling gently against the seat with every sharp turn he took. The car was supposed to be a ghost. It was stashed in a subterranean garage with biometric locks that only his DNA could bypass. It was his fail-safe, the vehicle meant to carry him to a hidden life if the empire finally crumbled. Yet here was this child, Ara, her small frame swallowed by the oversized passenger seat, looking for all the world like she belonged there. The juxtaposition was nauseating. The interior of the car was a high-tech fortress of sleek carbon fiber and hidden compartments for suppressed sidearms. But next to the gear shift, sat that floral backpack, smelling faintly of vanilla and school bus dust. Du-yun cut the headlights as he veered into a narrow, lightless alleyway, the car coasting to a silent halt behind a row of rusted shipping containers. The sudden absence of motion seemed to amplify the silence. He turned his head slowly, his gaze drifting from the girl's peaceful face to the antique brass key still tucked into her palm. The scar on his cheek felt like a hot wire. That key was more than metal. It was a confession. It belonged to Maya, a woman who had been his son before the shadows of the Han Syndicate swallowed him whole. He had been told she died in a tragic accident, the night he ascended to the rank of boss. He reached out, his hand trembling as he finally brushed the edge of the key. The metal was warm, heated not by fire, but by the girl's skin. "Who sent you?" he whispered, his voice a gravelly ghost of itself. He wasn't even sure he wanted an answer. If she was a messenger from his enemies, she was the most cruel weapon they had ever devised. If she was something else, something impossible, then his entire life for the last 20 years had been a lie built on a foundation of blood. The fire outside flared one last time, a distant explosion sending a pulse of light through the alley. It illuminated the cabin for a fraction of a second, casting Du-yun's rugged, scarred profile in sharp relief against Aura's soft, round features. For the first time, he noticed the way her bangs were cut, straight across, exactly how Maya used to wear hers. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the night air raced down his spine. He wasn't just looking at a stranger in his car. He was looking at a living, breathing piece of a past he had been forced to cremate. The girl's breathing shifted. Her small chest rose in a deeper inhale and her fingers twitched around the key. The tiger of Seoul found himself holding his breath, paralyzed by a fear that no hitman's blade could ever instill. He was a man who ruled through terror, yet he was terrified of a 7-year-old opening her eyes. As she began to stir, the weight of the night crashed down on him. The bridges were burned, the police were coming, and his enemies were hunting him. But the greatest storm was currently waking up in his passenger seat. The silence in the alley was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine and the distant, muffled wail of sirens that seemed to belong to another world. Du-yun didn't move. He sat as still as a statue, his eyes fixed on Aura. His mind, usually a precision instrument of strategy and survival, was spinning. How did a child pass through 3 layers of encrypted security? How did she bypass the silent alarms that should have alerted his phone the moment the car door was touched? He leaned back, his gaze scanning the interior for signs of forced entry. There were none. No broken glass, no tampered wires. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't broken in. She had used the key. His eyes fell back to the brass ornament in her hand. If that key still worked, if it was the master override he had coded into his life back when he still trusted people, then she wasn't an intruder. She was an invited guest from a ghost. He reached toward the floral backpack, his fingers brushing the fabric with a tentative, almost fearful touch. He expected to find a tracker, a bomb, or a ransom note. Instead, his fingers felt the soft corner of a stuffed animal and the crinkle of old paper. The girl's eyes suddenly fluttered open. They weren't filled with the wide-eyed terror he was used to seeing in people who looked at him. There was no flinching from the jagged red scar that marked his face like a curse. Instead, Aura blinked slowly, rubbing her eyes with her free hand while the other kept its death grip on the brass key. She looked at the blood on his jacket, then up at his face, her expression one of quiet, heartbreaking recognition. "You're late," she whispered. Her voice was tiny, silver-thin, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Du-yun felt the air leave his lungs. "How did you get in here, kid? Who gave you that?" He gestured to the key, his voice sounding harsher than he intended. Aura didn't seem intimidated by the gravel in his tone. She sat up straighter, adjusting the straps of her backpack as if preparing for a long journey. "My mom said if the world started to burn, I should come to the silver car in the basement. She said the man with the mark on his face would be the only one who could hear the key." The world was burning. The bridge was a pyre and the Han syndicate was currently being torn apart by Chairman Kang's betrayal. Du-yun's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Your mother," he managed to choke out. "Where is she?" Ara looked out the window at the orange-tinted smoke drifting over the city. A flicker of sadness crossed her face, but she didn't cry. She had the look of a child who had been forced to grow up in the span of a single night. "The bad men came to our house. She told me to run to the garage. She told me to wait for the tiger." She reached out then, her small, warm hand moving toward his blood-stained sleeve. Du-yun instinctively flinched, but she didn't pull back. She placed the brass key into his open palm, her fingers lingering against his skin. The contrast was staggering, his hand, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of sin, cradling a piece of history and the soft touch of a child. "She said you'd know what to do," Ara added, her voice unwavering. Du-yun looked down at the key. He realized then that she hadn't just been hiding in his car. She had been waiting for him as her final hope. She hadn't stumbled into his world by accident. She had been sent into the heart of the storm because her mother knew that behind the scarred ghost was a man who still remembered the melody that Key was meant to play. He wasn't just a getaway driver anymore. He was a guardian, and for the first time in 20 years, the most dangerous man in Seoul had a reason to be afraid of the dark. The brass key felt unnaturally heavy in Du-yun's palm, the cold metal drawing the heat from his skin. As he stared at the intricate vinework, the smell of the burning bridge and the metallic tang of blood faded, replaced by the ghost of a memory so vivid it made his lungs ache. He was no longer in a dark alley in the industrial district. He was standing in a sun-drenched apartment in Busan, 20 years younger, with a face that was still smooth and a heart that hadn't yet turned to stone. Maya had been laughing, her long black bangs falling over her eyes as she struggled to wind a vintage music box. He could see her hands, the same shape as Ara's, holding this exact key. "If you ever lose your way, Yun," she had whispered, her voice a melody that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades, "follow the sound of the music. This key doesn't just open a box, it's a promise that I'll always be the place you can come home to." He had given her that key on the night he decided to leave the syndicate. They were going to run. They had a plan, a map, and a future. But the syndicate didn't let people run. That same night the hitman had come. He remembered the screech of tires, the smell of gasoline, and the searing, white-hot agony as a blade opened his cheek, carving the cross-shaped mark that would become his legacy. When he woke up in a warehouse days later, Chairman Kang had sat by his bed and told him Maya was gone. Collateral damage in a fire that had leveled her apartment building. A sharp tug on his sleeve snapped him back to the present. He blinked, the neon glare of the city bleeding back into focus. Ara was watching him, her head tilted, her small hand pointing toward the floral backpack. "She kept the pictures in there," the girl said softly, "the ones of the man before he got hurt." With trembling fingers, Du-yun reached for the backpack. The fabric was worn, the sunflower patches frayed at the edges. It was a mundane object of childhood, yet opening it felt like breaking into a sacred tomb. Inside, tucked between a tattered coloring book and a change of clothes, was a thick, leather-bound envelope. He pulled it out, his breath hitching as he saw the handwriting on the front. It was Maya's script, elegant, slanted, and full of life. He didn't need to open the envelope to know what was inside. He could feel the weight of 20 years of unsaid words. The realization shattered the icy composure he had maintained since his death in Busan. Maya hadn't died in that fire. She had been hidden, perhaps protected, or perhaps exiled, while he was groomed to be the syndicate's most ruthless enforcer. Every drop of blood he had spilled, every life he had taken in the name of a grieving heart, had been based on a lie. He looked at Ara, and for the first time he didn't see a mystery or a burden. He saw a reflection. The way she held herself, the defiant set of her jaw, the quiet strength in her eyes, she was Maya's courage wrapped in a child's sweatshirt. The backpack wasn't just a bag of supplies. It was a bridge across 2 decades of silence. "She told me you were a king," Ara murmured, her voice pulling him deeper into the wreckage of his soul. "But she said a king is only as strong as the people he protects. Du-yun closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cool glass of the steering wheel. The ghost of Maya wasn't haunting him with guilt. She was calling him to account. For 20 years, he had been a tiger without a forest, a man who ruled a city of shadows. But as he gripped the key, the promise he thought he'd buried, he realized the fire outside was nothing compared to the one finally waking up inside him. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a man who had been given a second chance to keep the only promise that ever mattered. The stillness of the alley shattered like dropped glass. A sudden, blinding spotlight swept across the sedan's windshield, turning the swirling smoke into a wall of solid white. Du-yun didn't need to look at the side mirrors to know that the shadows had caught up. The low, rhythmic thrum of heavy-duty engines closing in from both ends of the narrow passage vibrated through the car's frame. Chairman Kang's hounds had found him, and they hadn't come for a conversation. "Stay down," Du-yun commanded, his voice dropping into a low, vibrating frequency that demanded absolute obedience. Ara didn't scream. She didn't even gasp. She simply tucked her knees to her chest and slid into the footwell, her small body disappearing into the shadows beneath the dashboard. She clutched her floral backpack like a shield, her eyes wide and fixed on Du-yun. She saw the transformation in an instant. The grieving man who had been staring at a key was gone, replaced by the tiger of Seoul. His movements became fluid, mechanical, and terrifyingly precise. A bullet punched through the rear window, spiderwebbing the reinforced glass but failing to penetrate. The sound was a sharp crack that echoed in the confined space. Du-yun didn't flinch. He slammed the car into reverse, the tires biting into the grime of the alley. He needed to move, but he couldn't drive like a madman, not with a child unsecured on the floor. He had to be a surgeon with a 2-ton scalpel. "Close your eyes, Ara," he said, his hand reaching out to steady her as he spun the wheel. "Count to 20. Do not stop counting until I tell you." 1, 2. Her tiny voice started, muffled by the fabric of her sweatshirt. The first hitman's vehicle, a black SUV, attempted to block the exit. Du-yun didn't brake. He accelerated, the sedan's reinforced bumper hitting the SUV's rear quarter panel with a bone-jarring crunch. The airbag sensors hissed but stayed silent, bypassed by his custom overrides. As the SUV spun out, a man leaned out of the passenger window with a submachine gun. Du-yun reached into the hidden compartment beneath his armrest, his fingers closing around a suppressed pistol. He didn't look away from the road. He fired 3 rounds through his own side window, the glass shattering outward. The shooter outside vanished from the frame. 9, 10. Ara's voice trembled, but she didn't stop. Another car roared up behind them, its headlights flashing in the rearview mirror like the eyes of an angry god. They were back on the approach to the bridge now, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning rubber and gasoline. The fire from the wreckage above cast long, flickering shadows that danced across the interior of the car, making the blood on Du-yun's jacket look like wet ink. A hail of gunfire erupted from behind, tracers streaking past the windows like angry hornets. Du-yun steered with one hand, his eyes darting between the road and the small girl huddled near his feet. A stray bullet sparked off the door frame, inches from where her head had been moments before. A cold, murderous heat rose in his chest, a feeling far more intense than any territorial dispute. This wasn't about the syndicate or the throne. They were shooting at the only piece of Maya he had left. He pulled a hard drift, the sedan sliding sideways across the rain-slicked entrance of the bridge. The pursuit car tried to follow, but Du-yun tapped the brakes, causing the hitmen to overcorrect. Their vehicle clipped the flaming debris of a fallen support beam, flipping into a spectacular, rolling wreck that vanished into the orange haze. 18, 19. Du-yun straightened the wheel, the car screaming out onto the open road, leaving the fire and the fallen men behind. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a jagged edge of fury in its wake. He reached down, his fingers gently brushing the top of Ara's head. 20, he said softly. Ara looked up, her face pale but her eyes remarkably steady. She crawled back into the seat, clutching the brass key so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked at the shattered glass on the floor, then at the man with the scar. "Are the bad men gone?" she asked. Du-yun looked into the rearview mirror, watching the flames recede into the distance. "For now," he replied, his voice hardening. "But they've forgotten one thing, Ara. You don't hunt a tiger in his own forest." The safe house was a windowless concrete cell beneath an abandoned textile factory, smelling of damp earth and old grease. It was the kind of place designed for hiding bodies, not harboring children. Du-yun sat on a rusted folding chair, his silhouette cast long and jagged against the wall by a single flickering shop light. Across from him, Ara had finally succumbed to exhaustion, her head resting on a pile of moth-eaten moving blankets. Even in sleep, her hand remained curled near her chest, as if guarding the air where the key had been. Du-yun reached for the floral backpack. He moved with a heavy, uncharacteristic hesitation, his hands, the hands of a butcher, feeling clumsy against the soft fabric. He unzipped the main compartment and pulled out the leather-bound envelope he had seen earlier. Inside were dozens of letters, some yellowed with age, others fresh and crisp, all addressed to a man who had officially been dead to the world of the living for 20 years. He opened the first one, dated 3 years after the Busan fire. "Yun, they told me you were gone, but I see your shadow in every crowded street." The ink was slightly blurred, as if the paper had been damp when it was written. "I've changed my name. I've moved 3 times. Chairman Kang's men are everywhere, but they don't look for ghosts. I'm living in the silence you left behind." As he flipped through the pages, the years bled into one another. He read about Maya's struggle to build a life in the margins, working backbreaking hours in a laundry to stay off the grid. Then he found the letter that stopped his heart. It was dated 8 years ago. "I named her Ara. It means beautiful and good. Everything this world has tried to take from us. She has your eyes, Yun. When she gets angry, she sets her jaw just like you do before a fight. I tell her stories about a king who lost his way, but who would come for us if the stars ever went out?" A low, guttural sound escaped Du-yun's throat, a sob he had suppressed for 2 decades. He realized then that his entire reign as the scarred ghost had been a hollow performance. While he was out executing rivals and consolidating power for the man who had lied to him, the only thing that truly mattered was growing up in a tiny, hidden apartment, listening to stories of a father she had never met. The letters became more frantic toward the end. The most recent one, written only days ago, was stained with dark, circular spots, blood. "Kang found us. He doesn't want the girl, he wants to use her to keep you on your leash forever. If you are reading this, I am already gone. Don't come for me, Yun, take the key, take our daughter, be the man I told her you were." Du-yun looked up from the paper, his gaze falling on the sleeping girl. The backpack wasn't just a bag of supplies. It was a map of a life stolen by the very man he called Chairman. Kang hadn't just taken his face and his future. He had turned Du-yun into his personal monster by feeding him the ashes of a lie. The silence of the safe house was suddenly suffocating. He stood up, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key, the metal catching the dim light. It wasn't just a key to a music box anymore. It was a key to a war. He looked at the letters spread out on the table, the evidence of a woman's 20-year sacrifice, and then at the innocent child who had traveled through fire to bring them to him. "I'm coming for him, Maya," he whispered into the cold, stagnant air. His voice was no longer a ghost, it was a father's. "And this time I'm burning the whole world down." The damp air of the safe house felt like a shroud, but the rage building in Du-yun's chest was a wildfire. He sat in the flickering half-light, the letter from Maya still trembling in his hand. The words burned into his mind. "Kang found us." For 20 years, Du-yun had been the chairman's most loyal shadow, a blade that struck without question because he believed he had nothing left to live for. He had credited Kang with saving him from the wreckage of the Busan fire, with giving a broken man a purpose. Now the truth was laid bare in Maya's desperate script. The chairman hadn't saved him, he had harvested him. Du-yun stood up, his shadow stretching across the concrete floor like a dark, jagged omen. He remembered the night of the fire with a sudden, agonizing clarity that had been buried under decades of trauma. He remembered the specific way the syndicate hitmen had moved, their tactical precision, the way they had avoided lethal shots on him while ensuring the apartment block was completely cut off. He remembered Kang's face at the hospital, the manufactured grief in the old man's eyes as he whispered, "She's gone, Du-yun. Now you belong to the family." It had been a masterclass in psychological warfare. By staged managing Maya's death, Kang had stripped away Du-yun's humanity, leaving behind a hollow vessel that could be filled with nothing but cold, absolute loyalty. He had turned a man with a future into a monster with a grudge. Every rival he had executed, every bone he had broken in Kang's name, had been a tribute to a lie. The chairman had stolen 20 years of fatherhood, 20 years of love, and replaced them with a cross-shaped scar and a reputation built on corpses. He looked over at Ara, who was shifting in her sleep, her small brow furrowed as if she were dreaming of the fire they had just escaped. She was the living evidence of Kang's failure. The chairman had tried to extinguish the light, but Maya had kept a single ember burning in secret, waiting for the day Du-yun would finally be forced to see. A cold, methodical stillness settled over him. This was the chairman's ultimate sin. He had taught Du-yun exactly how to destroy an empire. He had trained the very wolf that was now turning its head toward the throat of the pack. Du-yun reached for his burner phone, his thumb hovering over a contact labeled only with a single digit. He had spent his life protecting Kang's interests, knowing every hidden asset, every black market ledger, and every vulnerability in the chairman's fortress. "You should have killed me in Busan, old man," Du-yun hissed, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the safe house. He realized now that Ara wasn't just a passenger, she was the reckoning. Kang had kept her as a contingency, a leash to pull if Du-yun ever grew too powerful, but Kang had underestimated the power of the key. He had underestimated a mother's foresight and a daughter's courage. As Du-yun began to check the chambers of his weapons, the scarred ghost was gone. In his place was a man who had finally found the lock for his brass key. The chairman had spent 2 decades building a monster, and tonight, that monster was coming home. The transition from hunter to guardian was a subtle shift in the physics of the room. Du-yun stood over the tactical map of the district spread across the safe house table, his eyes no longer seeking the most efficient way to end lives, but the most certain way to preserve one. He watched the steady rise and fall of Ara's shoulders as she slept. To the world, she was a liability, a weakness to be exploited. To him, she was a single candle flickering in a hurricane, and he would become the wall of stone that kept the wind at bay. He began to work with a quiet, lethal grace. He didn't reach for his heaviest weaponry. Instead, he gathered flashbangs, smoke canisters, and a series of electronic jammers he'd stolen from a syndicate supply depot months ago. His objective had shifted. In the past, he would have waited for the hitmen to arrive and painted the walls with them. Tonight, his success wouldn't be measured in body counts, but in the distance he could put between Ara and the reach of Chairman Kang. "Ara," he said, his voice a soft command as he knelt by the moving blankets, "it's time to go." She sat up instantly, her eyes clear and alert. She didn't ask where they were going or if the bad men were close. She simply reached for her floral backpack and the brass key, trusting the man with the scar as if he were the king her mother had promised. As they emerged from the factory into the pre-dawn gray, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and impending rain. Du-yun moved first, a shadow merging with shadows. He saw the gleam of a sniper's scope on a rooftop 3 blocks away, a vantage point he had personally scouted for the syndicate a year prior. Instead of engaging, he triggered a remote signal on his phone. A block away, a series of decoy flares he'd set in a trash bin ignited, drawing the sniper's focus to the wrong intersection. He led Ara through the labyrinthine guts of the city, utility tunnels, narrow crawlspaces between tenements, and steam-filled alleyways. Every move was a chess piece played against his own training. He knew exactly how Kang, cleanup crews thought because he had written their manual. He anticipated their perimeter, slipping through a gap in their patrol timing that only someone who had timed those heartbeats himself would know. At one point, they reached a narrow gap between two buildings that led to the waterfront. A black sedan was idling at the far end, two men leaning against the hood with submachine guns held low. They were looking for a fight, for a target to erupt from the darkness. Du-yun didn't give it to them. He rolled a canister of high-density smoke into the street, and as the gray cloud billowed to swallow the light, he didn't fire a single shot. He picked Ara up, her small weight light against his chest, and moved through the fog with the silent precision of a ghost. By the time the smoke cleared, the men were coughing and aiming at shadows, unaware that their target had already bypassed them through an old drainage pipe. Du-yun set Ara back on her feet once they reached the rusted iron gates of the shipping yard. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the terrifying weight of responsibility. For 20 years, he had used his brilliance to create darkness. Now, using it to navigate toward the light was the hardest thing he had ever done. He looked down at the girl, whose face was smudged with soot but whose gaze remained unbroken. He realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't running from death. He was running toward a future he finally had the key to unlock. The shipping yard was a graveyard of rusted steel and salt-crusted iron, illuminated by the flickering, unnatural blue of a dozen police cruisers and the steady, cold beams of Chairman Kang's private motorcade. The air tasted of brine and betrayal. Han Du-yun stood at the center of the yard, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight, while a phalanx of gunmen held their sights on his heart. 10 paces away, Chairman Kang sat in the back of a black limousine, his face obscured by the tinted glass, the man who had authored Du-yun's misery now waiting to collect the final debt. "You're late for your own funeral, Du-yun," Kang's voice crackled over a megaphone, thin and metallic. "The girl, bring her forward and perhaps I'll let you die with your dignity intact." Du-yun didn't move. He felt the weight of the brass key in his pocket, a cold anchor against his thigh. He looked at the men surrounding him, men he had trained, men who feared him, and then he looked back at the shadows of a nearby shipping container where Ara stood hidden. He had spent 20 years building a throne of bone and shadow, a kingdom of fear that stretched from the docks to the high-rises of Gangnam. It was an empire worth billions, built on the lie that he was alone in the world. Slowly, deliberately, Du-yun reached into his inner jacket pocket. The gunmen flinched, their fingers tightening on their triggers. But he didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a small, encrypted drive, the digital skeleton key to every offshore account, every blackmail file, and every hidden asset the Han Syndicate possessed. It was the empire itself, compressed into a sliver of silicon. "You want the girl because she's the only thing that can hurt me," Du-yun shouted, his voice steady, echoing off the steel containers. "But you've underestimated what I'm willing to lose. I don't want the throne anymore, Kang. I don't want the blood and I don't want the name." He held the drive aloft. "This is everything. The accounts, the routes, the names of every official you've bought. It's yours, all of it. In exchange, the girl walks. She disappears and you never look for her again. If a single one of your men follows us, a dead man switch triggers, and every file on this drive goes to the National Police Agency." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in his life, Du-yun saw Chairman Kang step out of the car. The old man looked frail in the moonlight, his eyes narrowing as he weighed the value of a child against the value of absolute power. To a man like Kang, there was no contest. The girl was a needle, the empire was the haystack. "You would give it all up?" Kang asked, his voice hushed with genuine disbelief. "For a ghost's brat?" "I'm not giving it up for a ghost," Du-yun replied, his gaze shifting for a split second toward Ara's hiding spot. "I'm buying back my soul." Kang signaled his men. The guns lowered, though the tension remained thick enough to choke. The chairman stepped forward, snatching the drive from Du-yun's hand with a greedy, trembling grip. He checked the display, saw the encryption keys, and let out a dry, rattling laugh. "You were always too sentimental, Du-yun. That was the only flaw in the weapon I built." "I'm not your weapon anymore," Du-yun said. He turned his back on the chairman, the ultimate sign of disrespect and the final proof of his freedom. He walked toward the shadows, picking up Ara's small, shaking hand in his own. As they walked away from the lights, the sirens, and the empire he had burned to the ground, Du-yun didn't look back. He had entered the yard as a boss, but he was leaving as something he hadn't been in 20 years, a father. The trade was complete. He was penniless, hunted, and stripped of his crown, but as he felt Ara's fingers tighten around his, he knew he had never been more powerful. The roar of the city had faded into the rhythmic, eternal pulse of the tide. Far from the neon scars of Seoul and the charred remains of the bridge, the air was clean, tasting of salt and the cold promise of winter. Han Du-yun stood on a weathered wooden deck overlooking the East Sea, his silhouette no longer the sharp, predatory outline of a mob boss, but something softer, worn smooth by the weight of a quiet dawn. The cross-shaped scar on his cheek remained, a permanent map of where he had been, but for the first time in 20 years, it didn't ache with the memory of fire. Beside him, Ara stood with her hands resting on the railing, her long black hair dancing in the sea breeze. Between them sat the object that had survived the flames and the blood, the heavy, ornate music box Maya had hidden away for a lifetime. It was a beautiful, tarnished thing, its wood inlaid with the same silver vines that decorated the brass key. Du-yun felt a strange, hollow trembling in his fingers as he reached into his pocket. He pulled out the key, the metal catching the first golden rays of the sun breaking over the horizon. He looked at Ara, seeing the reflection of the woman he had lost and the future he had found. "She wanted you to have this," Du-yun said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the wind. "She said it was a promise." Ara took the key from his palm. Her movement was deliberate, her small face set with a gravity that mirrored his own. She slid the brass teeth into the lock. There was a faint, mechanical click, a sound more profound than any gunshot Du-yun had ever fired. As she turned it, the lid creaked open, and a delicate, crystalline melody began to chime, the notes floating out over the crashing waves. Inside the velvet-lined box lay a single photograph, preserved in plastic. It was a picture taken in the brief window of peace before the Busan fire. A younger Du-yun, his face unscarred and radiant, sat on a park bench with Maya. Between them, Maya held a tiny infant wrapped in a white blanket. On the back, in her elegant script, were the words, "For when the music starts again." Du-yun closed his eyes, let the melody wash over him, and for the first time since he was a boy, he let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 2 decades. The empire was gone. The money, the power, and the scarred ghost had been buried in the shipping yard. He had nothing left but the clothes on his back, a hidden cottage by the sea, and the daughter who had saved him from himself. Ara reached out, her small hand slipping into his calloused one. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. The silence between them was no longer filled with the ghosts of the past. It was a vast, open space where a new story could be written. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun climb higher, turning the dark water into a sheet of hammered gold. The music box eventually slowed, the last note lingering in the salt air before fading into the sound of the surf. Du-yun squeezed her hand gently, a silent vow to the woman in the photograph and the girl by his side. There was no turning back to the shadows. The key had done its job. It had unlocked the only door that mattered. "Come on," Du-yun said softly, turning away from the railing toward the small, warm lights of the house behind them. "Let's go home."